I think that's the problem that you said you had were, in a sense, you can do these kinds of analysis. You can go away and spend a lot of time and do clever things. We can produce agent-based models. But these don't necessarily count for very much if you can't communicate the findings in a way that decision makers or the bureaucracy or whoever makes those decisions can understand. And I think that this comes up a lot. I think the danger is to blame the decision makers. Oh, they should know more. They shouldn't commit to these existing methodologies. But one question I want to throw back maybe to you, and maybe other people might say something here, is how does there's a reason, I think, why there's a reason why decision makers will tend towards these traditional approaches, even if they know them to be very limited, because they may believe, they may be wrong, that at least they understand what is being presented to them, or they can fit that into an existing category, or more importantly, they can pass it to another expert who can assess that. They understand what to look for, how to assess the quality of that piece of work. Whereas with complexity approaches, because they're new, and agent-based models, and I work with these as well, there's a tendency to end up with because of the complexity, end up with a kind of black box approach where you as an expert find yourself in a situation saying, I can produce this nice graph, and when questions are asked about exactly how it's produced, a lot of complexity is mentioned and you just don't have the time to go into. If you like, each model becomes a bespoke approach. So the question I have really, and it's a more general question, is how would we go about, and of course I'm at the Open University, so maybe I should mention education, how would we go about creating a principled methodology that experts, policymakers, people in positions to make these decisions could at least have some understanding, and also that those can be interchangeably passed around to different experts, because it seems the key would be that a report can be produced that can be passed to another expert in complexity approaches who can assess the quality of that. Now, I, as an agent-based modeler, spend a lot of time reviewing papers in my area, and I find it very difficult to assess the quality, even from the scientific paper, of the models themselves, because so much is hidden. It's a black box. So what I'm saying is, are there ways of opening the black box, of essentially producing a narrative that makes sense to the policymaker? Maybe it's just a long-term education process. Maybe there's a role for some kind of professional body. I don't know. So that's one question I put to you.
Or a think tank.
Or potentially a think tank, Greg, yes. I think that has to happen for some credibility. I was at a recent event, and it was full of people who work for very large banks, making apologies and looking very downbeat. And what they said is, we use models which we don't believe, but everybody else uses them. And the thing is, if you're wrong because everybody else is wrong, you don't get fired. Yeah. But if you're wrong and because you chose a novel model and everybody else did something else, then you get fired. So there's a herd effect as well. Yeah. That how one combats this, I think, is something we're trying to do as a community. So I'd be interested in how that's done. And then finally, just on a more kind of basic methodological point about feedback and things. Ultimately, if you're making I've never been in a situation to do this, but if you're making a proposal to say, this is the analysis I've done, this is my advice to you, in a sense, it's all based on a counterfactual, because you can't, if they select your proposal, how do you know that another proposal that was selected wouldn't have been equally as good or better? So there is a kind of, ultimately, a leap of faith required. One can't ever be certain in some way. So these are big problems, but I think these are problems that if they could be in some way tackled that many people could understand in some simple way, then these models might be more accepted. So that's my response.
Thanks, Dave. So I'll ask Bridget to respond to that if she'd like, and then I'll open it up to the floor.
Okay. There's quite a lot there to respond to. Black boxes versus common sense, actually, I think is probably one of the key debates in this area. Actually, I would say that most of the models that are used, if you like, the standard models, are equally black box. Now, if I look at, say, people believe, for example, transport models, and yet when you begin to unpack those, you discover they're mostly driven by a set of residuals which are held constant through the future, without which the thing wouldn't solve. If you look at macro models, everybody's always fiddling the residuals to get the answer that they thought was sensible. So they're all black boxes. So the question is, can you produce something where the assumptions are sufficiently transparent and well set out that the non-expert has a chance of understanding them? Because actually what happens otherwise, in fact, possibly not in some financial areas, but certainly in policy-making circles, actually what happens in the end is they get ignored.
Absolutely.
So what you get is the experts come along and say, well, it's all going to be like this. And then Mrs. Thatcher comes along and says, yeah, I don't care about your cost-benefit ratio. I think the Jubilee line extension is a good idea. And she was right. The thing is now full. We actually had to put an extra carriage on all the trains, which wasn't planned to happen until sometime in another couple of decades. And in fact, when the guy running conference I was organising, the guy running it was just about to happen, and somebody said, well, how long will this take to fill up? And he said, about 45 minutes. And that was true. It filled up almost immediately. So the forecast stuff is really badly done. And sometimes the models that actually effectively are in somebody's head, the implicit model, which is trying to capture all this stuff in how you think, that turns out to be a judgment, which then ignores all the standard modelling, which is seen to be black box. I'm very interested in what you say about not being able to understand the agent-based stuff, because the kind of ones that I'm trying to build, at any rate, try to be as simple as possible, and try to be sufficiently simple that you can explore what they mean by playing around with them, solving them lots of times, changing the parameters, trying to make sure that you've captured everything that you might be able to know about it, and in the process captured all the uncertainty and all the ways that this system might develop and could emerge as you go forward. And when you present that kind of thing to policymakers, had a meeting with one model yesterday, actually they get it. If it can be sufficiently simple that they understand that you've got, they may think you've missed something, but they'll understand the rules of engagement that you've got. But that's in an area, that was in housing, where there aren't really these sorts of given a huge edifice. We've been doing this way, somebody said to me in transport, well, we've been doing this way for 30 years, so how can that be wrong? Look, we've made all these decisions and it's been great. And you think, well, yeah, but actually we've underinvested in transport for the last 30 years, so how can you be right? And of course, if you get into the area that I didn't really talk about so much on aviation, then that's my argument on aviation is actually a very simple one when it comes down to it, although the analysis that would eventually lie behind that, and if you try and get the feedbacks into it, it becomes quite an interesting thing to try and model. So first bit of modelling is, does a world city need a world-class airport? Question 1. Can Heathrow be a world-class airport? Question 2. I think the answer to the first question, my judgment is at the moment, answer the first question yes, answer the second question no. If we need a world-class airport somewhere in the southeast, can it be on land? No, because that's politically too difficult. It's too expensive politically. So where's that left? I become a proponent of an estuary airport as being the only place where you could put significant scale of operation. Is any of that thought process possible within our existing systems of thinking about these things? The answer to that is no. There is nowhere in the existing process where you can have that kind of analysis done, and yet that is the kind of thing that you need to have done, and need to have done in a very transparent way if anybody's going to be able to answer the questions.
Thank you very much, Bridget. So I'm going to throw it open to the floor now, and I'm going to try and again prioritise people I don't know. Gentleman there with the glasses. Hilton. Okay.
Yeah, actually.
Sorry, I didn't recognise you there, Hilton.
It was the top of his head. Yeah, exactly.
No comment.
It's a very simple question. In your, you didn't put opportunity cost in as one of the factors. I just wondered, is there a philosophical reason? Is there a reason why that doesn't come into the complexity assessment?
Sorry, I didn't hear the first part. I didn't put up what?
You had
dynamics and feedbacks and
you had feedbacks, but you didn't have opportunity costs. The cost of the alternative use of capital. I just wondered why you excluded that. Is there a philosophical reason, or is it not part of complexity that
I would say that opportunity cost gets measured in the standard analysis in any case. It might not be measured as well, but I think it's much more about the dynamics of the benefits that is missing in much of this. So, for example, there's been quite a few studies which say small projects are better than large projects. They have a better payback. The opportunity cost of the large project is too big, but that's actually because they're not incorporating into the benefits any thought about the dynamics and the feedbacks. They're just saying, oh, that's too hard. So therefore, by definition, a list of small projects is always better than a list of large projects. So I suppose I would say it's in the sort of how you're thinking about the opportunity cost is implicit in how you're thinking about dynamics and feedbacks rather than being a separate topic.
Okay, one question I had was about quantification, Bridget. Could you give us an idea of what the old model for Crossrail came out with as a benefit to London, and what the new models kind of suggest is the actual benefit over time? Do you have those sort of numbers to hand?
Well, they do keep changing. The original business case, if you like, the standard business case, had a net present value of costs of something like 6.2 billion and a net present value of benefits of 12.8.
12.8. Okay.
And that was on the basis of assuming that trips get made and then saying that because you've now got this new piece of infrastructure, some people will save time by using the new infrastructure.
Yeah.
And some people will save time because other people are using the new infrastructure, if you like. So you get a decongested system.
Yeah.
So in fact, although the capacity, the net capacity is something like 80,000 using it in the peak, it was only assumed for the business case, the original business case, that some 35,000 would be using the new system. If, of course, you assume that everything else fills up, so actually there's pent-up demand, so you didn't start with an equilibrium, in other words.
Sure.
So you could get another 80,000 people net onto the system.
Yeah.
That's when you get up to 70 billion of benefits.
70 billion.
70 billion
Yeah.
against an NPV, that's NPV, against a net present value cost of 6 to 8 and a cash cost of 16.
So
16 is the cash cost.
So the original NPV under the old model was 12.8 billion, and under the new model was 70 billion. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Wow. Okay.
And in fact, when we first presented we didn't present 70 billion first off, on the grounds that would scare the horses.
Okay.
So if I'd come along and said, it's not 12, it's 70, they'd have said, run away and play. This is another sort of way that you have to be subtle. If you'd said that, they'd have just said, piss off, basically. Yeah. So you're too stupid. And there were people going around giving out very, very large numbers on some much more static analysis, actually. So we actually thought quite carefully about having the most conservative assumptions that you could possibly have, and came out with a number of around 28 billion.
Okay.
So big enough really to be serious, very conservative assumptions, and hard to argue against.
Okay, excellent. I think
and really pushed.
To me, that represents the sort of the quantum of the things we're talking about here. Old model looking at sort of 12.8 billion benefit versus new models of 70 billion benefits. Right, John.
Yes, I'd like to question both for Bridget and for
David.
complexity theory.
Okay.
Because for the first time today, I've started to understand what people were speaking to me about. And the real question is, who are the real beneficiaries and who are not? For that reason, by the way, I'm against HS2 because I come from Camden and a whole community is going to be wiped out just near Euston Station. Crazy. I'm in favour of Crossrail, but I gather I'm going to have to pay something towards that, and I'd like you to tell us who's paying what in the Crossrail scheme. But I want to give you the example of the Docklands Light Railway. Cost about 3 to 4 billion, I think I'm right. There was an exercise done on 4 or 5 stations on that route, and the value of land and people who owned land and property in the area got a benefit of 13 billion. So the question to be put, and that needs to be put, is why not introduce a transport infrastructure funding system, which is done in the US,
Yeah.
which needs to be done, because the only fair way to pay for these things is that those that are going to benefit should pay towards it, and those that are going to lose. And the real question also around this is, on these big schemes, what's the real consultation with the communities affecting them, and how is that done? And really my question's about how does the complexity approach help us to take these decisions as against the more traditional approach I think the GLA would take?
Thank you, John. Very good questions.
Yes, indeed. Where shall I start? Let's start with the property tax idea, which you've raised in the context of transport infrastructure. Well, it's both, in fact. Unless you build on it, you're not going to get it back. There are proposals which are being, well, they're being worked on. They keep being announced, but nothing actually necessarily happens too much. But I think the first big scheme of that nature will be a Northern Line extension into Battersea. So Battersea is the old Battersea Power Station, which has been empty since the early 80s. Indeed, it's had its roof taken off. It's in the last stages of decrepitude, but nonetheless it is listed and therefore needs to be propped up. The only way to get sufficient development into that site to make it possible to pay for all of that is to have better transport. And indeed, to pay for that better transport, since actually it's 2 stops. So transport, the standard transport analysis, and in some ways it kind of almost encapsulates some of these arguments. A standard transport analysis would never justify a spur, a tunnelled spur from the Northern Line at Kennington through to Battersea, which is only 2 stops. It just doesn't save anybody any time. It only justifies itself if it makes it possible to deliver people to a new piece of development which wouldn't otherwise be able to happen because you wouldn't be able to get the people there. And indeed, that is one of the so that's going to be one, I think, of the big experimental projects around precisely the idea that you create a system of collecting the business rates on these sorts of developments for a period which enables you to pay back. Plus, of course, the fares, and don't forget the fares. The fares in all these systems pay certainly for more than the operating costs of these railways. They pay for the rolling stock, maintenance, operation, staff, and make a contribution to the infrastructure, but don't normally cover enough of it, because they're not prepared to set the fares that high, to pay for all of it. So that is certainly happening. The rules of the game, however, in the case of the DLR, but also in things like Crossrail, are that the way that the powers work, which enable you to build a railway, have very narrow specification. So to actually acquire some property rights around it, which would enable you to do the development yourself and capture it that way, is extremely difficult. So you need to think that is certainly one of the reasons why thinking about transport infrastructure funding is a particular benefit. How has that affected Crossrail? Well, Crossrail came along while we were still kind of playing around with these ideas, and indeed there is a business rate supplement which makes a contribution, but by no means a complete contribution. It's a couple of billion towards the cash cost of Crossrail it will eventually provide. And that's a surcharge on business rates of properties with a rateable value over a particular threshold, with the idea that you only capture the properties that are really going to benefit from this because it's going to benefit the high-end area. So the easiest way to do that was with a cut-off on rateable values. Apart from that, again, quite a lot of Crossrail is paid for through the people who buy tickets to go on it, or indeed the system in general, since Crossrail is part of the railway system. Whether you're paying, whatever you pay with your Oyster charge will make a contribution and help cover the costs of actually running the railway. So a combination of fares and the business rate supplement plus about 4 billion from all of us together collectively, i.e. the taxpayer, is what actually is paying for it. Your final question on consultation and how we do this, Well, I think it's two things. Firstly, in comparison to, say, somewhere like France, we're very mean about compensation. Compensation for displacement is hard to get, very bureaucratic, and you wait years. In comparison, in France, they're generous and you get it immediately. And that means that balancing the people who are disbenefited against the people who get a benefit in the longer term is much easier to do. And I can see from a London perspective, you might well like Crossrail but hate high speed too. But if in Leeds, for example, you're going to take a very different approach. And it's a pity that Nigel Foster, who was originally hoping to be the discussant today, comes from Leeds, and with whom I've worked on high speed too. If he was sitting where David is sitting, he would be taking a very strongly pro-HS2 stance, because it's not about the residents of Camden, it's about the residents of Manchester, Leeds, Newcastle, Sheffield, etc. But I agree that the compensation process is not done very well, and the consultation process I'm not even going to start on.
Excellent. David, yeah.
Just, I'm not a domain expert, I'm not competent to comment on the specifics of these projects, but leading on from the final point about consultation, maybe a bit of a tangent, there is an area of modelling, an agent-based modelling called participatory modelling. And the idea here, and this is maybe something for the future, the idea here is that you can create, there's been some studies done and some work done, you can create online games essentially where any interested party, citizen, can try out different options, and that collectively, by playing this game, what's actually happening is a kind of negotiation and a kind of consultation. So that potentially is, I mean, I'm a bit of a technology person, I don't claim that we can solve all problems, but it's another way of getting very fast kind of input in a non-threatening way. People think they're playing a game. There's been some experiments with water management and farmers, because they have knock-on effects, and essentially they found that the best results came from letting people play not themselves but another role. So if you're a person who lives in a particular district, you might play the role of a local government decision maker, whereas they might play the role of somebody who lives in a particular district. And through this kind of iterative process, you get possible futures where you go, oh, okay, that's interesting, and these can be stored and looked at. So that's potentially one way that this technology could help in a more sort of democratic consultation process.
Excellent.
I think that's really interesting, because actually one thing is consultation is a very odd term for most of what goes on, which is, although it did actually have a particular effect in high speed too, but most of it is a set of experts, a set of bureaucrats and a set of politicians decide on something, and then they go and tell you that this is a good idea. And then people get quite frustrated when saying they think it's a bad idea has absolutely no impact on the outcome. Actually, in the case of the first consultation on high speed 2, it's added £500 million to the cost of the project by creating the political pressure was such that there's now going to be an extra tunnel under the Chilterns to protect the good residents of places like Aylesbury and Amersham. So yeah, that worked in that case, but it was a political process, not a participatory process.
Thank you. Next question. This gentleman here, third from the front.
Zoltan Zavadi. You touched on a few intangibles, and I wonder if you'd consider including the following in a cost-benefit analysis. Things like leadership, pride, inspiration, prestige, and then social equity, social stability. And can those things be quantified and included in a cost-benefit analysis? And I guess the second part to this is, if they cannot, then can a CBA be anything more than a perspective on a decision rather than the basis for a decision? Thank you.
I think the whole idea of just coming up with a number is, it just enables oversimple ranking where you've actually got a whole lot of different dimensions, and the number tends to trump. Indeed, there are lots of people out there who will tell me that transport gets more than its fair share of spending because it's able to have lots of numbers, which, considering I think it's still underinvested in, is interesting. But probably we invested in the wrong things, because we invest in then the things that you can numerically quantify, and you forget about all the rest, even when you're told you have to have a list of them. Nonetheless, they get sort of pushed down the list, like the caveats do when you're producing a model. You say, well, I'm not terribly sure about this, but I think it might be X. then X is what everybody goes off with, and the I'm not terribly sure about this, and these are all the caveats gets forgotten. So I think we should abandon the whole cost-benefit ratio, one number solution, and tell people that they can't have it. I don't think that'll happen, Mark Hugh, but that's what I kind of go around saying. That might give you a better chance to think about the elements of pride and leadership and so on. I'm certainly not sure how you would incorporate those into a cost-benefit analysis. They definitely got incorporated into our willingness to waste money on an Olympics bid. Yeah, what was that about? It was actually happening in the GLA when I was first started there, but they kept me well away from it because I told everybody that I didn't think it was worth the money, and I still don't. So you can over-egg those things as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Richard Bronk.
Just to pick up on the last question, your answer to it, would you advocate what's I think called technically multi-goal cost-benefit analysis, where you would make explicit the need for value choices and choice between often incommensurable goals, as well as doing analysis in respect of each goal? So your cost-benefit analysis would analyse how many newts are killed, as well as what you take off journey times, but ultimately, and this is the stuff of democracy, how you value newts against journey times or connectivity is a value choice, it's not an analytical question, and is best not therefore subsumed in some willingness to pay calculation which just buries that value choice.
So that's interesting. I've just been involved in a piece of work which is around the Thames Tideway Tunnel, which is the first piece of serious sewage works that we've had to do since Bazalgette in the 19th century, and is designed to stop sewer outflows when there's any rain, because we've got more and more built up stuff. You get more sewers overflowing and more turds going down the river, or indeed up the river, depending which way the tide's flowing. And the value of that has all been based on a willingness to pay calculation. So people went off and did surveys on how much are you prepared to pay not to see the turds floating up and down the river. And out of that, they came up with a value which I think is £57 per year on average per person. And that's then the basis of how you think about these benefits. And I was asked to look at this, and we've come up with at least another way of thinking about it on an economic basis, which is not so much what people are willing to pay, but in fact more about if people aren't willing to come and live in London because of this, then what would the consequences be? But it doesn't actually answer the question, I have to say. How many people would be put off? So getting away from the willingness to pay stuff, I'm quite kind of enthusiastic about. I'm just not I'm not totally convinced about how you create I'm convinced about how you create a negotiated world around how you think about these alternatives, and I think in practice that's actually what happens at the end of the day. And then the really interesting thing then is the relative importance and power of different lobby groups. So the pro-newt group or the pro-birds is really interesting. The importance of birds or newts versus the importance of economic activity or people can often then come down to who's prepared to shout loudest, or who behaves least shyly, and clearly means that we put far more emphasis in practice on birds and the environment and so on than any of the analytical solutions do. If you look at, for example, I was doing, what was I doing? Oh, Stansted, the second runway at Stansted, and looking at the importance of noise and aircraft noise. And there's been huge amounts of research done on the cost of noise. And you would have to quadruple or more the value of noise, the price of noise, in order for it to make any difference to the value of the runways. It's completely trumped by everything else. And yet, politically, socially, that's clearly not true. Because what people, get upset about in Stansted, or indeed the same is true incidentally for Heathrow Runway 3, that's what people get upset about. They get upset about the noise, but the analysis tells you it doesn't matter. And there's got to be a disconnect there. It's clearly not true. So there's definitely something about this willingness to pay stuff which doesn't work. Or alternatively, of course, what people say and what they really think are two different things, which is, of course, equally possible. So I don't know, really. I mean, I think on that basis it is complex and it becomes a negotiation.
Thank you. Any other questions? Ben?
Very quick one. Just drawing a line between Paul's presentation this morning and your presentation. Just interested to note the three areas that you listed of complex systems: dynamics, feedback, and behaviours. You didn't talk about networks, and it seems to me that actually there's a direct applicability of some of the network models Paul was talking about to the area that you're working on. I just wondered if you'd experimented on that in Volterra or in synthesis.
Well, I suppose that the answer in the context of this is that I've never had the opportunity to include a specific network impact on these things. So it's much more about an individual motivation, although that, of course, the motivation stuff will itself be affected by the network in which you're operating. But I suppose I tried to pick out the aspects that we've actually managed to say something about in the examples that I've got. And I think so far, certainly in any of these, not really managed to include a specific network effect in them. Although, yeah, I absolutely agree with you.
Okay. Steve, did you want to come in as well?
He's good at waiting. He's good at waiting for the microphone, isn't he? Yeah.
Yes.
So if a student comes to me with a new idea, perhaps a new model, and I'm worried that there's a black box because they've developed the model, typically what I ask them to do is to demonstrate how that model works on something which I know the answer for. So to demonstrate that it's working successfully, and then I say, okay, now let's move on to the new thing. Now that's not always possible in these policy areas because sometimes things are so new that there are no standard models. But I just wondered if you have experience of doing that precise mechanism to try and convince both policymakers and people that what you're doing in your models is valuable. And particularly if you're talking about differences between 12 and 70 million, it seems quite a discrepancy. I wouldn't trust anybody who comes up with two answers such a long way apart.
Which is why I didn't. Well, and indeed you're right, and that's why I didn't actually go that far, because at the time, it was new stuff and needed to be kind of pinned down. Post hoc testing of particularly large projects is extremely difficult. Okay, so are there any good examples? I've looked for examples on roads, never found anything. I've looked for, there was a huge amount of resource actually put into, and there's a resource problem here as well in terms of the testing. What's proportional in terms of what you might spend to get what kind of result? Huge amount of effort put into the Jubilee Line extension. And indeed some of the DLR ones. And the thing is, even if you come up and you say, well, for example, around the Jubilee Line extension stations, even within the period before they opened, you saw relatively fast growth around those stations compared to other locations in general. So you've got a good sort of prima facie case. But when you really try to unpack that, the data becomes, you get some good sort of headline results, and the DLR would be the same. If you try and unpack that into a lot of detail, you run into horrible data problems, you run into confidentiality problems with the data, you run into kind of modelling difficulties and so on, and the holding things constant problem becomes quite acute as well. So the short answer is the compare and the contrast on the outcomes is at a high level of aggregation, basically. So you can show that the systems fill up more quickly than the model suggested. You can show that development happens more quickly around your stations than in other places, and that's, again, not covered in the model. You can show some of the sort of productivity differentials, although people argue about those statistics. So you can show some sort of headline results, but in terms of actually testing, robust testing of the models, of complex system models, particularly when you've got one history, and the whole point about the model is it's giving you a variety of potential outcomes, I'm not sure that we're yet in a state where we've got enough experience to be able to do that, at least in these fields. Julian's going to give us a counterexample, I can tell.
What I wondered, I mean, start with the Crossrail. I mean, all your calculations seem to be assuming things are running properly, and you roughly know the scenario you're dealing with. But supposing, in fact, we decided to have an airport on the Thames Estuary, which I dearly hope we would have. I mean, the Crossrail would be used in a quite different way. And the other, of course, aspect which we've looked about at the UCL is these questions of further events like we had in 2005, you know, some massive dislocation, what the advantages and the costs, benefits of crises in the systems. And is that factored into the cost? That presumably is a big question. How much value do you put in a smoothly running multi sort of transport system? Because, I mean, whatever happens, we're still going to have days when, you know, the central line doesn't work, etc. And isn't the value of that, is that in your calculation?
Not really, no, because none of the models of the actual transport system itself they don't have accidents and they don't have disruption in them. So resilience comes in as a qualitative aspect rather than a quantitative aspect, absolutely. Although I would certainly view one of the key elements, the qualitative elements in the case for Crossrail, is giving you resilience to access to Docklands and Canary Wharf, which is otherwise only got the DLR, Jubilee line and one road.
And ferries. I'd rather run for ferries.
Okay, well there aren't many ferries. Well, the capacity of the ferry to get people off is pretty limited. I was not going to mention the ferries, but I didn't know about that bit. Mistake. Anyway, so the element of resilience, I absolutely agree, is important, but it's certainly not captured in the kind of very detailed transport models that we generally run, which are all cost minimising models, which assume that the system works and everybody can get on, however delayed they are. They'll eventually get on the train. They don't stop taking the trip. And indeed, it was that stop taking the trip element that we were trying to capture when we did the Crossrail case. So yeah, that's missing. I agree about that. The sort of structural shifts and how you might be robust to structural shift. I think that's a problem too. I think that and in part it depends how you've actually structured it. So in the case of Crossrail, it's structured to say getting into the high productivity part of London, which I think will remain the centre of London, even if you add some bits around it, adds value. So I'm quite comfortable that that's fairly robust. I'm slightly less comfortable that that's some of the elements of HS2 actually on that basis if we start moving other things around, although the case for HS2 doesn't really rest upon access to Heathrow because there aren't many domestic flights left into Heathrow. The slots are far more valuable for everything else. So again, I think it's pretty robust to that. But that's not, I've never managed to work out a way of doing a kind of quantified analysis of it. It's more qualitative.
I'm going to take the chairman's prerogative to actually ask the last question, if you don't mind. I mean, one of the frustrating things about sort of complexity techniques is that it all sounds incredibly scientific and very sophisticated, and Bridget mentioned something called fuzzy clustering techniques, for example. But isn't the point with the material we're talking about is actually we're trying to model the real world better as it actually works and to make decisions based on a sort of a model that is as reflective of the world as we can get? Aren't we just trying to basically build a model of... Really?
No, I'm trying to answer a question.
Okay.
And I want the answer to that question to be as reflective of the relevant elements of the world as it is possible to be.
Sure, okay.
But it's important to start with what is the question?
Sure, absolutely.
And then look at what the key elements are so that you can create, because for me, one of the things that worries me sometimes about people doing complexity stuff is it gets very complicated rather than complex.
Okay.
So you're just putting more of, you end up with the kitchen sink in there because every time somebody will say, well, what about this aspect of reality that you haven't captured?
Okay.
The question is, does that aspect of reality matter?
Okay.
And I get, so you can see I'm going to get quite excited any moment. For me, it's deciding which elements of reality I really must understand and know about, and sometimes I can and sometimes I can't, so there's always a weakness there, but trying to make it as simple as possible and as relevant as possible, so as many people as possible can understand it and can see what assumptions I've made.
Okay.
So I don't accept any presentation of a forecast which doesn't also give me the history.
Yeah.
And I don't accept anything which doesn't tell me what the assumptions are.
Excellent. Okay, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, could I ask you all to thank Bridget and for Dave for stepping in at the last minute.